The episode opens with Richard Lindzen sharing his distinguished academic journey. After completing his doctorate at Harvard, Lindzen conducted research at various institutions, including the University of Washington and MIT, spending the majority of his career there before retiring in 2013. His work in atmospheric sciences focused initially on solvable phenomena, such as the quasi-biennial oscillation, a cyclic reversal of wind direction near the equator in the stratosphere. Unlike many fields, Lindzen found atmospheric science intellectually rewarding due to its problems being tangible and empirically verifiable. William Happer, a retired Princeton physics professor, also offers insight into his background, which spans nuclear physics and laser research. Raised partly in India and influenced by his family history connected to World War II scientific efforts, Happer contributed significantly to defense technologies, including parts of missile defense under the Strategic Defense Initiative. He became involved in climate science through his role as Director of Energy Research under President George H.W. Bush. Happer's take on climate policy is informed by first-hand experience with federal funding structures and scientific discourse in Washington, where climate researchers frequently resisted accountability and exhibited hostility when challenged. Both guests trace the shifting narrative of climate science from early concerns over global cooling and ozone depletion to the eventual rise of CO2 as the central villain. Initially, the environmental movement focused on pollution and energy, with worries about a coming ice age in the 1970s based on observed cooling trends from the warm 1930s baseline. The discovery that atmospheric sulfates could cool the Earth led to theories predicting global dimming, but when temperatures began rising again in the late 1970s, the focus pivoted sharply to global warming and greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide. Happer and Lindzen emphasize, however, that doubling atmospheric CO2 by itself would only induce modest warming of about 0.5 degrees Celsius. More significant warming estimates arise only when assumptions about feedback from water vapor and other factors are introduced. This shift coincided with a rise in political and media focus on CO2, which allowed the demonization of the gas and justified massive funding programs tied to energy policy. Both remarked that this politicization happened in earnest after films like Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth brought climate into popular consciousness, though significant scientific and political momentum had already been building for decades. A key theme throughout the podcast is the intersection of politics, funding, and climate science. Both men describe how vast sums of money flowing into climate research have created incentives for a consensus narrative to dominate and dissent to be suppressed. Lindzen reveals how attempts to publish skeptical work were met with resistance, including firing of journal editors who allowed such papers, while Happer recounts how climate researchers he dealt with refused genuine questioning and viewed themselves as politically allied with figures such as Senator Gore. The scale of financial interests distorts scientific inquiry. Universities, scientists, and administrators all benefit from climate grants, which often generate substantial overhead funding used discretionary by university leadership. This creates structural incentives to maintain the prevailing narrative at the expense of open inquiry. The complexity of this feedback is exacerbated by political polarization, especially in the United States, where climate science has become aligned with partisan identity. This environment stifles debate and promotes orthodoxy, reinforcing the notion that questioning climate alarmism equates to denialism or even moral failing. The guests repeatedly stress a critical distinction between science as a process and the misuse of science as an unquestionable source of authority. Lindzen emphasizes that science relies on continual challenge, testing, and revision. Scientific theories must be judged by their predictive power and empirical validation, not by a claim to consensus. The idea that the science is settled is incompatible with the true scientific method, especially given the complex and poorly understood nature of key climate variables like water vapor and clouds. The complexity of Earth's climate system, including the nonlinear behavior of the atmosphere and oceans governed by the Navier-Stokes equations, defies simplistic assertions of certainty. The flow of data and models show that climate varies naturally on many scales and that many feedback mechanisms remain elusive or poorly understood. Lindzen and Happer argue that the rush to declare global warming an unequivocal crisis shuts down essential scientific dialogue and inquiry, which is antithetical to progress. The technical challenge of climate prediction is highlighted as a central scientific issue. The nonlinear partial differential equations describing atmospheric fluid dynamics have no exact solutions and require enormous approximations in computer models. This situation is reminiscent of Werner Heisenberg's famed struggles with turbulence and fluid mechanics, underscoring the inherent difficulties in long-term forecasting of complex systems. Happer notes that such models can be useful to explore interactions, but have consistently failed to deliver accurate catastrophic predictions. Chaos theory, as introduced by Lorentz, complicates further the predictability of climate. Small changes in initial conditions can lead to vastly different outcomes, making precise long-term forecasts impossible. Despite this, climate models continue to be treated as authoritative predictors in policy debates, a contradiction the guests explore. They strongly urge a more nuanced understanding of the limits of modeling and caution against politicizing inherently uncertain scientific tools. Lindzen and Happer discuss historical climate variability extensively, pointing to significant warming and cooling episodes over millennia that occur independently of modern human activity or CO2 levels. They explore Milton Milankovich's orbital theory, explaining ice age cycles as a function of Earth's changing orbital parameters influencing solar insolation, particularly in the Arctic summer. This cyclical behavior, tied to planetary mechanics, has dictated ice ages over hundreds of thousands of years. Further, solar variability plays an important but often underappreciated role in climate fluctuations. Changes in solar irradiance, cosmic ray flux affecting cloud formation, and proxy data from isotopes like carbon-14 provide evidence that the sun's output is neither constant nor negligible. The medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age are cited as examples of natural climate variation coinciding with solar activity. The guests argue these factors deserve more attention than has been accorded in mainstream climate discussions. The episode explores the ways in which dissenting scientists have been marginalized or silenced. Both Lindzen and Happer recount personal experiences of receiving pushback or hostility for questioning the orthodox climate narrative. These ranged from being excluded from funding and conferences to outright censorship by scientific journals and institutions. The comparison is drawn to historical ideological incursions into science, such as the eugenics movement, where dominant socio-political forces captured scientific discourse to push agendas. Such conformity can be self-reinforcing as researchers fear career repercussions, and academic administrators depend on climate grants that incentivize adherence to the accepted line. The enemy of the people story is cited as an analogy for scientists or officials who challenge prevailing interests, illustrating the difficult balance between scientific integrity and institutional pressures. This climate of fear, the guests stress, damages science and ultimately society. Practical consequences of climate-driven policies, especially net zero initiatives, receive critical scrutiny. Lindzen and Happer challenge claims that decarbonization is universally beneficial or even feasible, pointing to the soaring energy costs in countries like the UK and Germany after transitioning to renewables. They highlight the risks posed to poorer nations and the developing world, which may be denied access to affordable, reliable electricity if coal and other fossil fuels are phased out prematurely due to ideological considerations. The guests note that supposedly clean plants today can capture most particulate pollutants effectively, reducing local environmental harm while continuing to power economies. They argue that restrictions on fossil fuels threaten economic development, job stability, and standards of living worldwide. The uneven global distribution of energy resources and infrastructure necessitates pragmatic policies rather than ideologically driven mandates that may do more harm than good. The podcast delves into the role of media and social platforms in shaping public perceptions of climate change. There is broad agreement that mainstream media outlets have become ideologically driven, often omitting or skewing information for political ends. This contributes to the fracturing of information ecosystems into echo chambers where people receive reinforcement rather than balanced analysis. The increased role of social media has accelerated both misinformation and censorship, making it difficult for the public to access diverse viewpoints or engage in substantive discussions. Moreover, the guests note the cult-like elements surrounding the climate narrative, fueled by fear, group identity, and moral imperatives that discourage skepticism. This dynamic creates a 2 minutes of hate mentality, reminiscent of dystopian fiction, wherein dissenters are vilified and debate is shut down. The consequences can be seen in widespread anxiety, especially among young people, and in the politicization of science as a tool for social control rather than a quest for truth. References to historical parallels illustrate the dangers of ideological capture of science. The eugenics movement of the early 20th century serves as a cautionary tale, demonstrating how science was co-opted to justify racist and exclusionary policies with devastating human consequences. Leading institutions and respected scientists endorsed these ideas before they were repudiated, often only due to external events, such as World War II. This history emphasizes that science is conducted by fallible humans susceptible to prevailing cultural and political pressures. It also indicates that scientific doctrines, once considered settled, can later be overturned. The guests argue for ongoing skepticism and pluralism in science, warning against dogmatic adherence to any single theory, especially when linked to powerful political interests.